All right, I would like to welcome everyone here on behalf of the Center for Arab American Studies and the Castle Dean's Office here at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. If you don't mind, I'm going to sit, even though I know some people can't see me very well. I'm recovering from surgery and I'm not good at standing at the moment. So basically, what we're here to talk about is this new census category, Middle Eastern, North African. What does it mean? Who does it apply to? Is it a good idea for the University of Michigan to start using this category? As those of you who are sort of following this news might realize, there's been a lot of advocacy about this in the community, for decades, going back decades, but in particular in the last few years, and a lot of advocacy on campus. So we're going to hear about all of that advocacy. And the Census Bureau has been testing a Middle Eastern and North African category for the last several years, and they asked the federal government to allow them to use this new Middle Eastern and North African category on the 2020 census, and they were turned down by the Office of Management and Budget, basically by the administration, which didn't want to use the new category. So the federal government is not going to be using this on the 2020 census, although there is still quite a bit of activism around it at the national level, and people have not given up hope entirely that it won't be on the 2020 census. But because of the distinctive population that we have here in southeastern Michigan, that we have on our campus in Dearborn, a city that's population is roughly half Arab American, really distinctive for a city of this size. There's no other really highly concentrated community nationally like there is here in Michigan. But also because historically this community is so important, and more Arab students are going to the University of Michigan-Ann Arbor, more and more students are going to the University of Michigan-Flint. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that these populations get counted, right? Get counted. Their experiences are distinctive from those of other white Americans, and their experiences in the university, their success rate, their mental health, their health, all the sort of needs of this population and the accomplishments of this population can't be counted. And we can't say how well our Arab students are doing until we can count them. Right? So that's sort of my motivation in trying to bring about this category as an administrator and faculty member who works with Arab American students. But what you're going to be hearing from is from people who are speaking from a variety of different backgrounds. And what we've sort of organized is for each person to talk for about 5 minutes. Some of them are going to be talking about the U of M very specifically, U of M Dearborn, our efforts, our ambitions, the way we want to see the category implemented on our campus. Some people are going to be talking more about the sort of the history of the activism behind this to help you understand really how important this is and why it's so important. So everyone's going to talk for about 5 minutes. And then we are going to open the floor and really have a discussion with you, I hope, because I hope you've got a lot of very strong opinions on this and a lot of attitude about what you think we should be doing and why and how. And so we want to be able to answer your questions too. So what I'm going to do really quickly is introduce everyone at once so that we can just sort of flow from speaker to speaker. So the person who's going to speak first is Ahmed Abu Zaneid. He's the director of the National Network for Arab American Communities. NNAAC serves a consortium of 27 independent Arab American community-based organizations in 11 states. It's dedicated to building the capacity of Arab American nonprofit organizations that focus on the needs and issues impacting local communities while working to collectively address specific issues nationally. NNAAC, which champions the movement of Take on Hate, is comprised of 3 main programs that include capacity building, advocacy, and civic engagement, and youth and community services. Prior to leading the NNAAC, Abu Zaneid co-founded and served as the chief operating officer of the Florida-based nonprofit Dream Defenders, an organization comprised of communities in struggle that was formed in the aftermath of the killing of Trayvon Martin. Through his work with Dream Defenders, Abu Zaneid, who also served as the organization's organizer and legal and policy director, helped lead the fight to end mass incarceration, police brutality, and zero tolerance policies in Florida schools. Our next speaker will be Yahya Alami Hafiz. He's a doctoral student of American culture and Arab and Muslim American studies on the Ann Arbor campus. He is the general coordinator of the U.S. chapter of Palestinian Youth Movement and previously organized with their San Diego chapter, as well as the San Diego chapter of Southwest Asian and North African Alliance, SWANA. As an undergraduate student in the University of California, San Diego, he was involved with efforts across 9 undergraduate University of California campuses to fight for the inclusion of a SWANA checkbox within undergraduate admission and financial aid demographic collection on that campus, and continued to push for the public release of this data and its expansion across all demographic data collected by the University of California. Our next speaker will be Jed Hideki. He's a 4th-year student studying biopsychology, cognition, and neuroscience at the University of Michigan-Ann Arbor. He was born in Lebanon and immigrated to the United States at 7 years old. He graduated from Fordson High School here in Dearborn, and went to the University of Michigan as a Bream Scholar, making him the first in his family to attend college. We have a lot of first-generation college students on our campus too, so you should be comfortable here. On campus, he's involved in medical research assessing the intersectionality of race, gender, and depression among medical interns. Moreover, he serves as an advisory board member on the Islamophobia Working Group and Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Jed also helps advise Pilot, a student-driven success model for first-generation and underrepresented students, and with the Arab Student Association. He's a big activist on the Ann Arbor campus. Our next speaker will be Ray Metz. Ray Metz is the Vice Chancellor for Enrollment Management and Student Life here at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. He's responsible for enrollment services, including admissions and orientation, financial aid and registration and records, student support services, including counseling, disability resource services, career services, academic support and tutoring, international student services and health services, and housing referrals, and co-curricular programs involving student activities, athletics, and recreation. Then we're going to hear from Christine Kelly-Williams, who is Associate Director of the Office of Institutional Research. And I don't have a big bio for Kelly, but it's a big job she does. And then finally, last but not least at all, we have Sarah El-Garagoli, who is the Vice President of Student Government here at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. Having been involved in numerous initiatives such as voter engagement and registration, El-Garagoli understands the power we have in groups. This is why she feels the implementation of a Middle Eastern North African category is so important, because it unifies us, or at least it is a step in the right direction. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Ahmed.
Great. Thank you, Sally. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending. I know that with student life, you all have a million things you could be doing right now, 100 different events, and plenty of them have free pizza. So thank you for joining us here today for this important discussion. Quite simply, as Sally laid out, we want to be counted. This discussion is really about Arab Americans being made to feel as if we have a place here in this this melting pot of the United States. In order to create our own category, we've obviously had to go through several hurdles, and we unfortunately were defeated in this latest effort. But it's gonna be a fight that we're gonna have to continue. If we have our own category, we're able to achieve the results of getting the much-needed data that we need to move our community forward. The data will allow us to better serve our communities. So what are the health issues that the Arab American communities are dealing with? Where do Arab Americans live? What are the civil rights issues that we're being challenged with? How do we can't count Arab American prisoners when most of them are being designated as white? If you look at the roll in many prisons, you'll start to see, white, and then next to them it'd be like Abdul Rahman something or Muhammad Abdul whatever, and you're like, wait a minute, well, this doesn't really accurately give us the numbers that we're looking for in order to ascertain in this day and age of the war on terror or the war on Islam or the war on Arabs or the war on the occupied, how does this affect our communities here in the United States? And so we're really at a disadvantage as far as counting our members, our community members, and figuring out what type of impact they've been facing. A new designation will also afford us the opportunity to be perceived as a minority community in the United States. And this is something that surely troubled the current administration. The fact that they would have another minority community to target officially as a minority community would, I'm sure, seem cumbersome to this presidential administration. There's also roots for the origin of this struggle. Arab Americans fought to be considered white at a point in time in this country. when whiteness was a requirement for citizenship. Now Arab Americans are fighting for the right not to be considered white. Arabs are not a race. We do not belong to any particular race. You have Arabs who are fair-skinned and blonde and blue-eyed, and you have Arabs who are darker, have more Afrocentric features. So this is something that needs to be reflected. You know, when we laid out the campaign to get the MENA category, there were also some challenges within our own community. Many Arabs and Muslims alike were concerned that if we did have our own designation and our own category, that our community would actually be more easily exposed to attacks by the government. And the recent example of Japanese internment is one that our community members haven't taken lightly. Around the period of time where this United States was questioning the allegiance of Japanese Americans because they were at war with Japan, they rounded up Japanese folks, even those born in the United States, and put them in internment camps. And we can see with the rhetoric coming out of the White House and across many political leaders across the U.S. That this is a point in time where many Arabs are afraid that a similar situation could occur for our community. Arab American loyalty to the United States is constantly questioned. And so, you know, that's going to be a continuing debate that we're going to have within our own community. Even with this coming census, even though there's no category such as MENA, our folks are still wondering how should they fill out the census, what should they mark, should they offer any additional info. I think another concern that we're looking at is this most recent proposal to have a citizenship question added to the census. So these are things that we're mindful of, we want to be cognizant of, and we want to educate our communities to the best of our abilities to assist them in answering these questions in a format that will allow us to get the data we need, to get the information we need, but would also allow them to feel protected and secured. Again, in this current moment where many do not feel protected and secured. I'll stop there and look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
And mine, I'm just going to have my phone here just to keep track of time. So I'm going to speak about two things. First, I wanted to talk about the efforts in the UC system to institute a Southwest Asian North African category. This was something I was involved in as my first year, as an undergraduate, and it was something that succeeded within 3 years. It was instituted, and just last year they had the first round of data publicly available across the UC system to keep track of not only Southwest Asian North African, but even within the disaggregated categories. So you can see, okay, in this campus there's this many Jordanian students, this many Armenian students, etc. So the history in the UC system is that students in UC Berkeley had come together, particularly around some of these issues that Ahmed brings up, to work together to bring up this category to the UC system to implement it. And this was a deliberately coalitional effort. So it was challenging the naming of the term Middle Eastern as something that is sort of like this colonial imposition. It defines the region in relation to Europe, in relation to the US, just generally in relation to the West, right? So this is why they use the term Southwest Asian North African, and I know that's not the term we're going for here, but just to give some historical context. And the deliberately coalitional effort was focused on centering Black Swana folks and Indigenous Swana folks, folks that are typically excluded within even our internal discourses and made invisible. So this is thinking about folks from Sudan, for example, or thinking about like Amazigh and Kurdish and Armenian folks. And it was really meant to be a very deliberate effort, not just to center Arab folks, but also thinking about the ways that all these different peoples within the region, even though there's contested histories, really making deliberate effort to challenge and work through those histories together, and to also expose the ways that similar rhetorics, for example, of Islamophobia, of anti-Arab racism, etc., affect not just Arabs, but many different peoples in the region while also homogenizing them. Within the UC system, the strategy that was implemented was getting resolutions passed in the student governments of each campus. And then we had an organization, the UCSA, the University of California Student Association, which was sort of like a broader student government for the entire system, where it passed as well. And then we brought it to the UC Office of the President, which then had the power to implement it. But then there was also an issue where on the individual campuses, this data wasn't being released. And when it was implemented, it was only implemented for specifically undergraduate admission and financial aid. So there was huge areas of demographic data collection where it wasn't being collected. For example, in counseling and psychological services, in university health systems, in just general research data, for example, we're still being aggregated into this white category. So that's what I had started to push towards in my junior and senior year at UC San Diego, was really getting them to expand their data collection, which is like a larger effort, and also think about faculty, think about staff. There's a question of what I call meaningful diversity or meaningful representation, right? So just because you have a certain amount of undergraduate students, is that reflected in the curriculum? Is that reflected in the faculty? Is that reflected in the staff, right? Can these undergraduates find mentorship at these various levels, right? And then the other question that I was asked to talk about was racial ambiguity. So there are a lot of folks within our communities that arguably pass as white. But then this also becomes, so first, this is a question that is historical. So the early Syrian, and I say Syrian in this sense, these are considered like Levant migrants. Early on in the immigration to the US, a lot of these folks were primarily lighter-skinned Levant folks that were Christian. And when they were going through these court cases to argue their whiteness, and they were arguing this not because, they believed like, oh, we are racially white. Really, a lot of these folks were identifying by their villages, they were identifying with their families, they were identifying maybe with their tribes or with their religion, right? They weren't necessarily identifying in racial terms, but they were really using this racial language as a strategy to access the civil rights and civil protections that white people were afforded that other folks weren't, right? So this was a very strategic, deliberate move. And arguably, it also did shape how they ended up perceiving themselves over time as like a socialization process. But this was definitely not the case for sort of later migrations of folks from different parts of the Middle East or North Africa that tended to be darker skinned, tended to be Muslim. Some of the arguments inside these court cases concerning whiteness, they were arguing that we're coming from this shared religious heritage as Christian people. If you're to argue that we are not white, you're also making an argument that Jesus is not white, and that didn't really sit well with the court system, right? That understood Christianity as kind of like this white heritage, right? But then later migrants couldn't make that same case. But then the issue of racial ambiguity is also a question of political power and representational power as well. So to understand racism, are we just understanding it on how folks are treated and perceived based off of their skin color? Are we also understanding it as the amount of political power that large groups of people have collectively, right? So if you think about the disenfranchisement of Middle Eastern North African peoples, historically for a long time we've been arguing that the US should not be funding what's called low intensity warfare, or really intervening on the politics of our region and really causing destabilization. Thinking about the sanctions of Iraq, the sanctions of Iran, the war in Afghanistan, the alliance with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia's involvement in Yemen, historical migration, the questions of refugees. These are all things that our communities are contesting, but don't necessarily have the same type of political power to challenge. And then in thinking about representational power, I'm just going to close off here, but thinking about how few opportunities within academia there are for our communities to really challenge the dominant narratives. So right now there's only 3 Arab American Studies programs that exist in the nation. One of them is here, the other is at the Ann Arbor campus, and the third one is in San Francisco State University. And then just thinking about, the types of discourses we see in films. So, thinking about American Sniper or, this recent film Beirut, right? When was the last time we got to see ourselves represented in a meaningful way in a popular film production or in a popular book or something like that, right? So there's other ways to think about racism that isn't just a question of white passing or not white passing. So I'll just leave it there and come back for questions. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jed Hideki. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel, Dr. Howell. Really appreciate that. I think I want to start off by saying, so this was about a little over a year ago on the University of Michigan's Ann Arbor campus. We were trying to figure out, and kind of want to reiterate what Dr. Howell brought up, and this is the idea that within the Arab community, the Middle Eastern North African community, for us to understand our issues and concerns, there isn't really anything to back that up. And the only thing that can back that up is data, right? So if we wanted to look at dropout rates, we wanted to look at recruitment, outreach, mental health concerns within the community. So that's kind of where the purpose kind of came about of implementing a box. And we knew at the time that even though the box was not implemented at the federal level, we knew that was a fight in itself, but our fight was more so on University of Michigan's campus. And so knowing that we live in the state of Michigan where you have the largest concentration of Middle Eastern North African individuals outside of the Middle East and North Africa, the idea was that there's a large population of students and on the Ann Arbor campus, there's obviously a large population here at U of M-Dearborn, and then there's also the same thing at U of M-Flint. And so the idea was that the University of Michigan kind of has a unique regional responsibility to implement the category. And so at the time, we were trying to figure out like the naming, right? So we're Arabs, we talk about that a lot, and we've heard the term Swana. We had just met Yahya at the time as well, kind of learned more about Swana and his efforts there at the UC system. So the only reason we ended up sticking to MENA is that it's more inclusive than using Arab. And at the same time, if the federal system and if the census implements a box, it's going to be called MENA. And the reason why that's important is because what the university would collect at the university level would have to report it back to the federal system. And so we wanted to make sure that both data would be consistent. So that was very important for us. And so MENA, we're using this term a lot, and just to kind of clarify, what does it really mean? So it includes the 22 Arab countries recognized by the Arab League, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. It includes 4 non-Arab countries, which includes Armenia, Turkey, Iran, and Israel. And then it also includes transnational communities. So if you think about Berber, Kurds, Chaldeans, many communities who don't identify themselves as Arab. And this was, at the time, it just kind of came about with a resolution that we pushed through the central student government. It was passed unanimously to implement the category. And then kind of conversations then kind of occurred from then on. So it was a group of students, maybe 4 or 5 of us. And then we started including more, and we realized that it had to be kind of a consensus among our community. So we included more students, we included staff members, we included faculty members, and then we ended up reaching out to U of M-Dearborn, so Dr. Howell and Sarah, and then we reached out to U of M-Flint to kind of say that there is a general agreement that this category must be implemented at the university level. And we got pushback, right? So pushbacks have been mentioned here at this table as well. So this idea of being targeted, that if the category is implemented. Well, it's interesting within itself to say that because, as I mentioned, we already have, so we know that there's the largest concentration of Middle Eastern North African individuals. So they know where we live for the most part. And the other part of that is that Homeland Security already targets us. So there isn't really, it's like this idea that we're always thinking of pushbacks of implementing the box, but we don't think of ways to benefit the community, right? So we don't even think about it the other way. And so that's where it kind of came about. So connected with faculty and staff members, and then going into this fall, we passed resolutions across all 3 campuses. We wrote up a petition signed by over 750 maybe staff and faculty members across 3 campuses. And then we launched a campaign called We Exist. And we created shirts, and this was prior to our meeting and our presentation to University of Michigan's regents at their meeting. And so what we did is I, Dr. Howell, Sarah, Yahya, and another faculty member, Dr. Evelyn El-Sultani, who is the director of the Arab and Muslim American Studies program at the University of Michigan's Ann Arbor campus. And we presented to the region, so we each made sure that we were covering the different topics, the different concerns, the need for the box, and then from then on, we had a meeting with the provost office, which included many others, the vice president for student life, the vice provost for enrollment management, and general counsel as well, to kind of think about what are concerns with when the box is being implemented. And what came out of that meeting is the university, for the most part, at that point, agreed. So at the table, it was like, yes, let's. It was no longer us convincing the university to implement the category. So there was a yes, let's do it. And then the phase that we are on at the current moment is this implementation process. And so this is where it's the unknown, right? So this is what we're trying to figure out. And what do I mean by that is that there is a common application that the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and Flint follow. U of M Dearborn does not follow common application, but we never know how, if they will, and how that will work out. So we're trying to think of a solution to implement the category that will fit all three campuses, and it may look differently for each campus. We know that all students go through orientation on all three campuses, so that's another way of us kind of figure out how many of us are on campus. And there have been other solutions kind of brought up, potential solutions. And we're trying to look even beyond that. So Student Life does a lot of assessment with this DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Strategic Planning. There's a lot of assessment on how do students feel welcomed. So we want to look at that within our MENA students as well, within the MENA community, and even scientific research where the MENA box is not implemented. So this is, beyond the admissions and registrar's offices as well. So it's not just an issue there. And so, yeah, so this is what we're currently at. We're waiting for a meeting to be set up to kind of discuss the next specific steps. Thank you.
Now we're here from Ray Matt.
Thank you everybody for being here, taking some time to address an issue that I think is of importance to everyone in the room. It is actually interesting to follow that because, if I'm honest, I heard a few things that I haven't heard before, and that isn't surprising because three campuses don't always communicate 100%. This issue for this campus goes back a long time, and at least for the last 3 years while I've been in this office, it's been an issue that we've been talking about. And I think for the first 2 years where the conversation really was following what the census was doing, what the federal government was doing, and we already knew that we would follow what the federal government did, and I think we assumed they were going to do what I consider to be the right thing to do and add it. I think it got more complicated this year because they didn't add it. We have been assuming that we would add the category. I also want to thank the student government on this campus who have been consistent for 3 years in bringing this topic up, but especially this year in having a resolution. And Sarah's voice has been consistent from the first time I met her till the last time we met just earlier this week. We have a draft, we have an idea of what we want to do. We expect to include it on the fall of 19 application, which will go out and be live in about 2.5 months. We are working through the details on how to make that happen. And if I'm honest, I think it's just the right thing to do. And so we have assumed that we would do this. It's just a matter of how and when. And for this campus, the assumption is we will do it this summer.
Hello, everyone. Christine Kelly-Williams from the Office of Institutional Research. Our task in the Office of Institutional Research is actually to call together the data that the institution collects from students and to report out on that in both the federal and state level, as well as internally and externally in different just standard reports, requests, marketing, and otherwise. And our office has in the past received requests from the students. In particular, I know of one because I took the call from a student who wanted some information about enrollment for a class project. But my office wasn't able to provide that data because we don't have a separate category. And so the student was quite surprised that we didn't have the information to share. And I asked the student, when you answered those questions on your application or your registration forms, how did you respond? Which category did you pick? And she didn't recall. And I think that that's quite common. And I asked her what she thought her other peers had responded, and she didn't know. So it's really about helping us do our job in our office. So I think today's discussion is really to help support the Vice Chancellor's Office and MSOL to collect the data by learning how is it that it needs to be represented. So in learning that from the voices at the table here and what's being done nationally and through the state, what is the community seeking to identify it, in which way, and then we can help support however that gets implemented. And the thing to remember is that we do, as it's been mentioned multiple times already, we do need to think about how we will call that information together when it's time to change it, when the government finally does implement a change at the census level.
Do you want
Yes.
to show the slide with the table you came up with?
So we've had a couple of ideas, and I know that several offices around campus are working on drafts of ideas, like Ray's already said. And there are different ways to do it. There have been suggestions. I think, Sally, you have the slide from the census slide.
So, yeah, this is the way the census asks the race. I mean, this is, if you take off this final bit here, the lastly, this is the way the university is going to be implementing this race and ethnicity question moving forward.
Well,
right?
so this exists already. The first, as you may recall, you were asked these questions, is the are you Hispanic or not question. Once you have answered that question, next it goes on to the race categories. And these are the ones we already ask. This is the federal requirement. There is room allowed by the federal government, gives us the opportunity to put subcategories, but we remember that if we choose to put something as a subcategory at the federal and state level of reporting, that needs to roll up into the category. So we can use the numbers internally. We cannot release the numbers federally or through the state, and they must roll up. And a subsequent idea we had was to ask it separately. So if the question is asked separately, then it would not roll up. And the one thing we need to think about as a community is, how does that impact us? If we ask the question separately and we give some student success data, enrollment numbers, recruiting numbers, graduation rates, and these sorts of topics based on these categories, students are categorized in one place. And then if we talk about the subsequent category, now we're talking about it in a completely different context, and it could, and I think I've heard people identify themselves in different ways. So if a student chooses Black or African American and then also says yes MENA, versus another student who may say white and then say also yes MENA, we have a group of students who actually then get parsed out categorically in different ways. So that's part of the conversation today. What do you think about it? How do you feel about it? What are the consequences after we've collected the data? How should it be shared?
On the topic of documentation, the past 2 semesters I have met with several student organizations and individual students to document their concerns about the Middle Eastern North African category, their ideas. A lot of students didn't even know this was a thing that was being discussed. So I'm just going to iterate a few of the things that happened before these conversations. I'm sorry, I'm just looking through my notes. So I understand that a few years ago on this campus, students were categorized as Arab, Middle Eastern, based on their names. So sheets of paper, so the names of our students were looked through. If the name sounded kind of Arab or sounded Middle Eastern, they were kind of categorized as such. Now, I've spoken with other people recently, and they find that very problematic as there may be people who categorize themselves as white, as of European descent, who have Arab, Muslim sounding names. So that's an issue in itself. However, I don't believe the university does that anymore, thankfully. So now I'll just be listing a few of the concerns and a few of the pieces of feedback that students have issued. I've met with student organizations such as the Arab Student Union. I've gotten feedback from the Iraqi American Student Association and others from the Chaldean American Student Association and other student organizations who have been vying for more visibility on our campus as well as our larger community. So One, if this category is created, what about the other identities and categories for other people? So I've heard concerns about people being documented who are from Afghanistan or from other ethnic groups. I've heard some people who want to dissect it even further into talking about European identities. Why are we kind of painting all white-looking people as white, and maybe disregarding the first-generation Americans who are from maybe Eastern European countries? Why are MENA identified people categorized as white anyway? So I've had wonderful discussions with students who would otherwise have categorized themselves as MENA, but I've never really looked into the roots of why they have to check white or, are compelled to check off the other box. They're concerned and confused about the differentiation between white and other, or the confusion, like the blending of the two. I have heard a lot about how this misrepresentation strips Arabs, Middle Easterners of our identities. I've heard of the term other being othering, so the idea that it marginalizes people and puts them to the side rather than putting them in a separate box. It moves them away altogether. So taking it to the University of Michigan-Dearborn, a lot of us have raised concerns about the diversity and inclusion that we hold dear. So are we really holding those values up to par if we are not implementing this MENA category? Or even having conversations about them, conversations about other categories too. So thankfully, we are going to be implementing this soon, so I think that upholds our values. And in light of the US Census decision to not include this, I just find it notable that they will be asking about citizenship. So that's something to discuss as well. So I just want to end a little bit. The things that we have done on this campus are the student government has issued a resolution in support of the Middle Eastern North African category. If you wish to see that, I will gladly supply it. We have had multiple presentations. For example, we, through student government, have presented at the 4th Annual Engagement Day. We hope to further these efforts and present this everywhere we can go. So if you are interested in learning more about our efforts, please talk to me after. Thank you.
So I want to add that the Faculty Congress voted on this issue at their meeting last month, and I wasn't there, but I hear it was a unanimous decision. So the faculty is also very much in support of this category. And I just want to augment one thing that Sarah said. So she talked about people being confused about the history of the Arab relationship to whiteness, or the history of even this racial category, MENA. I just want to encourage you, if you're curious, if you're concerned, take one of our Arab American Studies classes. In the fall, we're teaching Introduction to Arab American Studies, where we go really specifically into the history of the community and the history of its, the racial ambiguity of the community that Yahya talked about. So please come and take one of our classes. We're doing all sorts of exciting things. We need to see more of you in the classroom. So sorry, I just have to take a plug.
I'll be taking a class this semester,
Yes.
hopefully, the next semester.
So now I think, well, first off, do you have questions for one another? Or is there anything that you would like us to clarify, like a sort of a clarifying question before we move on and maybe talk about some of the politics of the questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
So I have a question for either you or Vice Chancellor. So we have spoken previously about the admissions applications. We've also spoken about other university documents such as surveys that were to be circulated around the university. So can you guys give any feedback about the implementation of this category on other documents other than the admissions documents?
So, Ray, you want to?
Feel free. I mean, you
Okay.
capture. Actually, I'll just say, I have a sense that everybody on the campus, every one of the vice chancellors supports this effort. Every one of us will be looking for opportunities to make use of it. It's an important part of our campus, and we want the information. So I feel totally confident that as we're doing small surveys, that we will incorporate it as a natural part of the campus, just as a part of who we are. But I know there are other official surveys that probably Christine should talk about.
And so generally, the standard practice in our office is once the student, if we have the demographic, all of the demographic biographical data that is attached to a student record remains there, and if we do some sort of external survey or if we create a survey internally on campus, when those data are broken out, then we would already have this information on a student, so we can categorize in that way. So it wouldn't have to be that we continue to ask the question over and over. And in fact, again, it's generally best if the question is once asked and that's it, so that we don't have migration just by error or forgetfulness to skew any of the data anywhere.
The other thing that I think we would do is that some of the standard surveys that we use often have a category of other questions that can be used that are identified by the institution. So I would guess that one of our extra questions will be something that focuses on MENA, right? Does it?
Yeah, that's another way of collecting the information as well. So
If it's not a part of the survey.
as folks want to help share that information with the campus, and when you want to let us know that, that is another way that we can get the information.
Yeah, I don't want to get into the weeds too much because it gets really complicated, but I know we had a conversation in the provost's office in Ann Arbor with their associate dean of enrollment management service, who was there too, who was talking about this. Where do you collect the data if you're going to have one point? Do you do it at admissions, or do you do it at the point of enrollment? Because as you guys know, here in Michigan, we're not allowed to use racial categories in our admissions processes. So she was especially concerned that if we do ask the census racial categories at the point of admissions for our own data collection, not to sway our admissions decisions. But she was concerned that if you change the admission question, that would raise a red flag with the state, and that it would create legal problems for the university that are unnecessary. She preferred to do it at the point of enrollment. So you've already been admitted, right? So that whole question of affirmative action is taken off the table, and at that point, these are, every student has to enroll at some point. So when you first enroll in the University of Michigan, that's when you can ask the question. So I'm not an administrator, this isn't my decision to make, but I was very, I thought that was a good strategy that would make sense for the whole university. And I just also want to add that, so there has been advocacy about this in the state of Michigan since the 1980s at least. And who was it that was pushing for this? It was Access, the Arab Community Center in Dearborn. It was the Chaldean Council, ACC. It was all the groups that provide services to the Arab American community or the Chaldean community who they don't, how can we know what Arab Americans' health needs are if they're not distinguished from other people in surveys of health data? Right? So the community has been very good about advocating for this at the state level. So our Department of Health and Human Services, many of the different agencies within the DHS actually do collect data on Arab Americans, and increasingly medical institutions like the University of Michigan Medical System does collect data on Arab Americans. Right? So we are moving in a direction as a state and as a society and as an institution. So we're just very happy to see our institution really hopefully playing a leadership role with that in the state. So any other questions?
Can I just make a quick clarification that it does go back that far? And when you mentioned Access, really, in effect, the two people that I have used most for, well, maybe the three would be including the person at the end of the line, but the other two would be actually Sarah, because we've had some back and forth about the time of application or the time of enrollment and which is preferred. But the other is Ish Ahmed from Access, who's really been the kind of source of guidance we've used in the admission office for how to approach this.
And he would say he's from the University of Michigan.
And he would say he's a proud alum of the University of Michigan-Dearborn.
What I would say about the UC system, so we do collect it at admissions as opposed to enrollment. And some of the valuable data that we get from that is how many students apply, right? And then how many of those that applied end up actually accepting the offer. And also getting accepted, right? So you can see comparatively, like, okay, compared to other groups, what percentage of applicants that are coming from MENA backgrounds are getting accepted into the programs. That can give you a little bit of a sense of educational disparities, right? And then of those what percentage of students are actually choosing to come to the University of Michigan, right? And so that can kind of also give you a sense of what are MENA students' perceptions of the university, right? So there is, I think, valuable data in that, and of course, you know, California is a different state, so I'm not as familiar with it. It's my first year here, so.
Can I ask a follow-up question? I'm interested. So you'll have to remind me, I apologize, I've forgotten. So you were talking about, is it SWANA, am I correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct.
And that was collected as one of the categories, a subset of categories, or is proposed here a third question?
So in the UC system application, it has these different categories, and then within it, it has subcategories. So SWANA is under white, but then it's a subcategory.
Okay.
So then in the question of reporting to the state or reporting federally, then it gets aggregated into white, but then internally within the university, right, we can access that data individually.
Right. It was just something that I was thinking of when you mentioned comparing admission rates or a student selecting the school, yes or no. In this structure here, a student can be within a MENA category, but if you're talking about comparing this to other groups, the only other group in comparison would be either in MENA or not in MENA.
Yeah.
So that would be one thing to consider.
Definitely.
So question on that. So that means if someone is Black MENA, would they identify white? I'm sorry, SWANA, Black SWANA. So if they would identify as white, SWANA, and Black.
So they would.
So someone's like.
So that's
Okay.
the tension, right? And I don't have the exact citation, but I know there's a study that like showed that folks in this like from these populations have somewhere of like between 1/4 to 1/3 of people putting like a wrong category. So the issue, right, is that even folks that are Black SWANA folks, technically within the definition, if you know they are
You could be very black. and
yeah, if you're
still
like
have
a
to
Black
put white on the
Egyptian,
census.
right? If you're like a Black
Yeah.
Egyptian, right? According to this, you are North African, you're white. You know what I mean? And that causes like a lot of issues. And then again, like this is also an issue of just the very shortcomings of defining like concrete racial categories when race itself is something that is like socially and politically constructed to reflect, you know, particular social and political interests, right?
There was a legal case here in Michigan where a man he was a Nubian from Egypt who was very, very dark skinned, worked for the Detroit school system, and he was not getting promoted. And so he was not getting promoted, he thought, because he was technically white on the forms. So he sued the state of Michigan to change his racial identity from white to black, and they turned him down. So the legal ambiguity here goes in multiple directions. Anyway, so now I want to open it up to questions from you.
And then I would just add
Okay, sorry. I
really
interrupted you, sorry.
quick on that point. Like I know the UC system a while ago caught some heat for when folks identified with multiple checkboxes. They basically just designated that person with what they consider kind of like the one category that they had like the least numbers in afterwards. So like and you wouldn't be able to find that out unless you kind of like had connections to like institutional research out there, but they would be reported because you know like a lot of reporting wouldn't let them be in multiple categories. They would be reported as basically whatever gave them the best numbers instead of like as mixed.
So if I can add a point to that,
Yeah.
the question you asked, if a person selected black because they believed that was their skin color, but they chose Caucasian and with a subset of MENA, what would happen, what is required, how the federal government guidelines set us about in categorizing that is they have selected two race categories and then would become multiracial. And which should have happened in California is multiracial, unless it had been prior to the change in 2010, because the multiracial category was not an option at that point. It would have been an other situation, I think.
So, sorry, question. I'm sorry, I know we're trying to open it up. So then if someone was to select that they're Hispanic or Latino, and then they selected down here with one of the categories, are they multiracial?
Thank you for asking that. I should have touched on that. So then the way that the categorization works is first you well, first, another piece that's not played into this is citizenship. If you are here on a visa, if you do not have citizenship, you are a non-resident alien, and regardless of what you check, your categorization is not counted because the reporting is based strictly on citizenship. So that aside, it's the ethnicity first. If you've selected Hispanic, it does not matter what you select after the fact. You're reported as a Hispanic person.
But I do want to clarify this, because we don't ask citizenship, do we?
We do.
We do.
It is on the application, are you a United States citizen?
I guess I don't know. Yeah, I think it's interesting that this thing on the board doesn't have the word other. The census is trying to get away from the word other because
Yes.
it recategorizes everybody who checks other. So if you check other and then write in Arab, Lebanese, whatever you want to write in, they'll recategorize you as white. So,
No, well, that was
does.
the census,
Yes, yes,
sorry,
yes.
I'm thinking higher ed.
No,
There's
no,
not-
the U.S. Census does that. So the U.S. Census is, I think in the 2020, I'm pretty sure that they're planning to not ask the other category just to make it, to force people to pick a category. So this is, I mean, it's really getting complicated, the census. But anyway, so do you have questions? Yes.
I showed up a little bit late, so I might have missed this part, but and you guys also touched on this, the lady to the very right and then the speaker to the left. And so I was just wondering, like, why does this particularly matter? Is it just simply like to have more accurate demographics data, like for use in maybe like statistical studies or whatever? Or does like this change have like greater ramifications that extend beyond the simple addition of like just a simple change to the census?
So as the folks who are, I think that it better suited to ask those questions, answer that question. Who's,
Yeah, I mean,
side the answer?
yeah. I mean, like, so for example, when you're looking at recruitment and outreach, you're looking at how many students are dropping out. You're looking at, so it's this like the umbrella of the academic disparities. So it's always looking at what are the concerns within the community. If you wanted to look at bias incidents and how bias incidents are being reported. So if there was, if an Arab is being targeted for or a MENA is being targeted for, whatever the reason is, then they're reported back as a white person being targeted. So it's interesting to look at that. Mental health concerns within the university health system. So it's this idea, yeah. So it's this idea of there's more to it than just knowing how many of us there are.
Yeah, so it would be, so Ahmed did talk about this in the very beginning. They were the first speaker. But yeah, so essentially considering like what are the unique needs of these communities, what are the unique disparities, and then how can we cultivate services to address those particular concerns, and maximize success within the university, but then, and I know we're talking about the university context, but then extending this outside of the university, even considering, okay, how many of our peoples are on welfare, getting food stamps, or we have a lot of our community members that are coming in from displaced backgrounds as refugees, as people that are exiled. So those folks are in particularly vulnerable situations, but then are being read as white or classified as white, right? So thinking about how can we address those particular disparities in a targeted, meaningful way, as opposed to just kind of like a general one-size-fits-all sort of approach.
I'll just add shortly that in this day and age where we hear the term intersectionality so frequently, and we look at the intersections between different people's identities, if you could be, as was referenced earlier, a Nubian, Arab, woman, Muslim, like those are all intersecting identities that capture the way this society is going to react or perhaps treat you or throughout a set of circumstances that you have to operate under. And so if we're not able to actually designate these identities properly, it doesn't allow for us to actually have some sort of impact and ramifications for a lot of the hate incidents, bigotry, and discrimination that a lot of our communities are facing today.
I just want to add one additional thing, sort of the other side of that too. So here on this campus, we have a very large Arab population, a very large Muslim population. We're not even talking about collecting religious identities here, but I mean, this is like the most distinctive thing about our campus is the percentage of Arab American students we have, and we don't know that number. As the person who's the director of our Center for Arab American Studies, I'm asked that question every day. How many Arab students do you have? I write grants for the university, and I basically have just picked a number out of the air. that I use, and I have no idea if it's accurate or not, right? We need to be able to express as a campus who we are, the thing that makes us distinctive, the thing that makes us unique. And also, if we knew more about the numbers, the demographics of the Arab community, then it might make it easier for the Arab community to say, hey, look, you know, it's great that the university is invested in this Center for Arab American Studies, but maybe we need more resources in the Center for Arab American Studies. You know, maybe we need to hire people in our School of Public Health or Education who are also doing research on these communities, right? And, you know, we have all sorts of relationships with the infrastructure of all the Arab and Muslim organizations in the Detroit area, and they're always looking to me for resources and services, and can you help us with this, can you help us with that, right? The more data I had, the more empowered I would be to make sure I was able to respond to those people and their requests. And I think that that should be also true of all the Arab student organizations on campus, right? That you know, you could make a lot of arguments about resources that you might want and deserve. If you had demographic data to back up your request, it would make you would probably get a lot further. Not that we're not already getting support, but I mean, I think that there's more that could be done on that front, and having numbers is just like the first basic step of that. So, okay, other questions? Yes.
Okay, so would you characterize the lashback or people that don't favor this, you know, their views as political when it comes to this issue, other than, you know, some of the concerns with other groups wanting to also be identified? So would you consider lots of the different, you know, counter arguments more on the political side? That's why some people are having trouble implementing this initiative. And a second question is, would this help our community? Will this be able to be a cornerstone to help our community advocate on a more policy level for things that we need?
Absolutely. And that's why we want the data at the national level. That's why we want the census to ask the question. It's like the first step of that. But unfortunately, we don't have power over the census. But we do have power over how things get asked here. But you're absolutely right. This is a stepping stone towards something bigger.
And I can't speak for Ann Arbor or Flint, but I've never heard one person on this campus not support this concept. If they're there, I don't know them, but I've never interacted with anyone who doesn't want to do this.
And in a sense, I feel like this kind of initiative at the local campuses, so we have the UC system now, we're trying at the various University of Michigan campuses, and then we also had one of our members of student government, Nadine Jawed, recently help pass a resolution with the Big Ten schools supporting similar initiatives. This is kind of, we're taking a both bottom up and like top down approach. So with ADC and I believe Access to in the Arab American Institute trying to work at the US Census, and then us trying to change how demographics are being collected here to just, you know, put pressure to change things.
Yeah, and also to piggyback off that, for the Big Ten schools part, just want to emphasize this. So annually, so the student governments of all Big Ten schools meet, and at this conference, each government gets to bring in 1 or 2 proposals that they passed in the previous year. And so what Ann Arbor campus did is bring the MENA resolution. And at the Big Ten conference, among all Big Ten schools, it was unanimously passed. And even the next steps within that is that there was a letter of support that was sent to all their enrollment management offices at their schools, and then they're calling in the provost office, and Ann Arbor's campus was like, "What's going on here? What should we do?" So it's become a larger concern even just beyond U of M. So
Yeah, and also I just want to know what are some of the views that you get countering this initiative, and do you consider them more political rather than substantive arguments against this?
I can say something based on some of the feedback that I've received from many non-MENA students. Some of the students I've spoken with who would otherwise have identified as white and not questioned it, so non-MENA, have brought up the topic of what about us? What about me? What about my family? What about the people in my classrooms who don't think about their identities but would if we had these conversations? So is that kind of is that kind of what? So I think being open and having conversations with people who wouldn't have otherwise brought these up is good. I am open to having these conversations, and I'm sure all of us would too. So I think of these discussions is kind of like conversations on race. We have a lot of those on this campus. But yeah.
So I'd like to add one thing, if I could, that on this campus, to me, it's just a no-brainer. Everybody supports it. If you go to Ferris State or you go to Northern Michigan, it looks different. And I think that the reason that it's important is that they don't see that it matters. And that's exactly, I think, why you are doing it, because it does matter. And in some ways, the University of Michigan-Dearborn and eventually all of the University of Michigan is like an easy win. We're just part of the process, but it's those other schools where it doesn't seem like it matters, where it does matter, that it needs, and it does matter here too, but I think some of the people just don't see that it matters. And that's the very reason that we need to do it.
Like, what are the broader implications for people who are not of the MENA communities? How do we make them understand our struggles? I mean, they can't understand our struggles, I think, but how can they better have conversations with us, and how can we relate to them?
Oh, one of the concerns was referenced earlier is that, many were afraid of targeting from the government, but as was laid out by Jed, the reality is the government knows where a majority of our folks live as is. After 9/11, actually, the FBI sent letters to Arab Americans all across the country, and particularly in Michigan, letting them know that they were due for a meeting with an FBI officer immediately so that they could collect intel on any of these folks' relationship, whether it existed or not, to 9/11. And so the argument that we make to our folks is that the benefits outweigh the risk. They're already watching, they're already targeting via so many policies, and so for us, we only saw benefits ahead via this policy.
And
Well, there's one other thing, which is that I think that the categories are politically, all of these categories are politically made. They're political products, right? So even the MENA category, which the census category does not include the same nations that Jed mentioned. It does not include Turkey. Turkey is officially part of Europe. So you can't include Turkey. It doesn't include Armenia. So there's a little bit of a difference between the census category and the way that Jed enumerated things earlier. But there's so many of these smaller identities, smaller communities, or communities that aren't national communities, like the Kurdish community, or the Turkmenistan people, or the Armenians, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans. How do they fit into this? And the thing is for years, Arab Americans were advocating for an Arab American checkbox, right? And the Arab American checkbox just broke down entirely on these other identities, right? So the MENA one is really a geographical designation. It's people who come from this certain region of the world and who, let's be honest, in our society are the targets of incredible Islamophobia, xenophobia, hostility, racial profiling right now. It's amazing what's happening too. For anyone to argue that an Italian American is going to have the same experiences as an Arab American, they just are not paying attention to what's happening in the world around them right now, right? But anyway, so there is contest within the Arab American community. The question I have, and I'm not going to ask it because we've had a hand up over here. I'll let you speak first. But my concern, and maybe it's a question I have for the audience, what if we put the checkbox on the university system and then Arab students don't check it? Right? So how do we, that's part of what we're doing here with this conversation. We're going to have another one in the fall, hopefully, too. And the idea is to educate the student body about this so that people feel confident checking the box, that they understand that this is an empowering thing to do, not a disempowering thing to do. Right? So that's my concern is, we don't have any data on whether people will check the box or not. I have an Arab American who's living with me right now in my house, and I filled out the census form last year, and the census asks you, do you have any people, non-family members living in your house? So I went downstairs and I gave her the census form and said, fill out the thing for yourself, and she checked white. And I was like, very frustrated with her, but that's how, she said, I'm not going to tell them I live here with you. They don't know. That was her response, right? So I think that's another challenge that we face that we need to think about. But Carmel, you had your hand.
Well, I was just curious if you all knew if the similar efforts were happening in Wayne State, Michigan State, Kalamazoo, Western, Eastern, you talked about it kind of in California and in the Big Ten schools, but Are these conversations and efforts happening on other campuses in Michigan?
So we actually contacted Wayne State University, and they have data on MENA students. They have specifically the box MENA, and they even developed graphs looking at recruitment efforts for MENA individuals at Wayne State University. And we know, so there are also a few other, so there's Brown University and there's a university in Texas, I don't know if it's Houston or not, who is having conversations, but there has not been an implementation yet.
Yeah, and then one of the things that we're working on developing at Ann Arbor is kind of like a starter kit toolkit for similar folks, because we have had like folks contacting us, hey, we want to have similar initiatives at our schools, how can we get started? So I know Nadine and Jed are working on that.
So any other questions? Yes.
Has this caused other groups like the LGBTQ community or people that have different sexual orientations to, I don't know if the university already does this, to advocate for that type of identification on university documents? I don't know if the university already has identifications like that.
For Ann Arbor, so through, I think what we have is Wolverine Access. I'm not sure what's used at U of Dearborn, but so on Wolverine Access, you get to, it's voluntary, not required, to put in your pronouns. So like he, his, she, her, hers, for professors and mostly faculty members to kind of know how to address students. So I know that's been implemented through the Spectrum Center in Ann Arbor. But
We have the same.
there you go.
It's just a different system.
Yeah, and I just a point about demographic data collection in general, like it can't be mandated for you to answer. It's like always optional, and I think that also definitely extends to sexual orientation and gender identity. I know at the UC system it wasn't necessarily correlated, like, oh, they did SWANA, now let's do this, but there were also initiatives to change the collection for folks' gender identities, and now there's actually 6 different categories. There's male, female, just general transgender, genderqueer, gender questioning, and other.
And things like the climate study that was recently done includes LGBTQ, so that it is an assumed category that we would want to follow up on.
Well, I thank you all for coming, audience, and I thank our panelists for coming. Educational. Thank you.